The morning began with silence. Caitlin Rose opened her eyes, lying on the wide bed, the sheets on her side neatly tucked in, the sheets on the other side empty, cold and untouched. Robert had left last night. Another business trip, this time to Chicago, for a conference on psychotherapy. He had left a note on the kitchen table, as he always did. Be back in a week. Call. Love, R. Caitlin stared at the note as the coffee maker hissed softly, filling the kitchen with the aroma of freshly brewed espresso. The paper was small, torn from a legal pad, and written in Robert's even handwriting, as even as his voice when he talked about his work, his patients, the theories Caitlin had long since stopped trying to understand. She was 36, but in the bathroom mirror she saw a woman who looked older. Not because of wrinkles, there were hardly any, just fine lines around her eyes that appeared when she smiled, and she rarely smiled. Her chestnut hair, which she once liked to wear in soft curls, was now pulled back into a messy bun. Caitlin was beautiful, everyone said so, from her neighbors to old friends she barely spoke to. High cheekbones, large gray-green eyes, skin that still retained the soft hue of youth. But there was something dim in her gaze, as if someone had turned off the light inside her. She knew it, felt it, but she couldn't do anything about it. Caitlin Rose was smart. She graduated with honors, studied literature and art, dreamed of writing essays on forgotten 19th-century authors, or maybe opening a gallery. But life turned out differently. She met Robert at 25, got married a year later, moved to a Boston suburb, to a house with a white picket fence and a garden that she never learned to love. Robert was 10 years older, already a well-known psychologist in narrow circles, whose lectures drew full halls. He was charming, smart, and knew how to listen in such a way that any woman felt like she was the only one in the room. Caitlin fell in love with his voice, his confidence, the way he looked at her, as if he saw something she herself did not notice. But over time, that look became less frequent, shorter, more absent-minded. Now he looked at her the way one looks at familiar furniture, with warmth, but without interest. The kitchen was spacious, with white cabinets and a marble countertop that Caitlin wiped down every morning, even though it was shiny anyway. She poured coffee into a ceramic mug that read "Best Wife," a gift from Robert for their 5th anniversary. The mug was heavy, and Caitlin held it with both hands as she stood by the window, looking out at the empty driveway. Robert's car, a black sedan, was parked at the airport. Her own, a silver hatchback, was gathering dust in the garage. Caitlin rarely went anywhere. Why? The supermarket, yoga twice a week, the occasional coffee shop with her neighbor Linda, who talked too loudly and too much. Everything else was here, in this house that seemed too big for them. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and checked her email. A couple of bills, an ad, an email from a charity she supported but didn't contribute to. Nothing important. Caitlin opened her calendar, empty except for an entry for yoga on Thursday. She sighed, closed her laptop, and looked at the clock. 10 in the morning. The day had barely begun, and already she felt it dragging on, endless and aimless. It wasn't always this way. In the early years of their marriage, Caitlin struggled to find herself. She took on projects. She wrote articles for local magazines, started a book club, even tried to restore old furniture inspired by an online video. But each time, something stalled. The articles didn't get published, the book club fell apart, and the furniture remained in the basement, covered in dust. Robert supported her, but his support was professional. He asked questions as if she were his client. How do you feel when you do this? Why do you think it's not working? Caitlin hated those questions. They made her feel small, stupid, incapable of understanding her own desires. Robert was different. His life was full of meaning. He got up at 5 in the morning, drank black coffee without sugar, read scientific articles, wrote books, and spoke at conferences. His name was published in magazines. He was invited to podcasts. System. Caitlin Rose woke up alone, as she had so many mornings in recent years. The silence in the house was almost palpable, as if the air were heavier with the lack of sounds to fill the emptiness. Robert, her husband, had left the night before another business trip, this time to Chicago for a psychotherapy conference. There was a note from him on the kitchen table, short and businesslike. Be back in a week. Call. Love, R. Caitlin stared at it as the coffee maker hummed softly, filling the kitchen with the bitter aroma of espresso. The note was small, written in Robert's even handwriting as even as his tone when he talked about his patients or his new theories. She picked up the mug, the one with the words, best wife, and felt the weight of it in her hands. A fifth anniversary gift that now seemed more like a taunt than a compliment. Caitlin was 36. In the bathroom mirror, she saw a woman who looked older than her years, not because of wrinkles, she had almost none, just the fine lines around her eyes that showed when she rarely smiled. Her brown hair, once styled in soft curls, was now pulled back into a messy bun. She knew she was beautiful, everyone said so, from her neighbors to old friends she barely spoke to. High cheekbones, large gray-green eyes, skin that still held a hint of youth. But there was something faded in her gaze, as if someone had turned off a light inside. She could feel it, but she didn't know how to get it back. She was smart. An honors student, literature and art, dreams of articles about forgotten authors or her own gallery. But life turned out differently. Meeting Robert at 25, getting married, moving to the suburbs of Boston, to a house with a white picket fence and a garden that she never fell in love with. Robert, 10 years older, was already a famous psychologist. His charm, his ability to listen, his look that once made her feel special conquered her. But over time, that look became less frequent, shorter, more absent-minded. Now he looked at her like a familiar detail of the interior with warmth, but without interest. The kitchen was spacious, with white cabinets and a marble countertop that Caitlin wiped down every morning, though it was already shiny. She poured coffee and stood by the window, looking out at the empty driveway. Robert's car, a black sedan, was at the airport. Her own hatchback was gathering dust in the garage. Caitlin rarely went anywhere. The supermarket, yoga twice a week, the occasional coffee shop with her neighbor Linda, who spoke too loudly. Everything else was here, in this house too big for two. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. Mail, bills, advertisements, a letter from a charity she had no involvement with. Her calendar was empty except for yoga on Thursday. Caitlin sighed and closed her laptop. 10 and the day dragged on, endless and aimless. It wasn't always like this. She spent the first years of her marriage searching for herself, writing articles for local magazines, trying to organize a book club, restoring furniture using online tutorials. But everything stopped. She decided it wasn't for her. Robert was supportive, but his questions, "What are you feeling? Why isn't it working?" sounded like a therapy session. They made her feel small, unable to understand her own desires. Robert was different. His life was full of purpose, waking up at 5 in the morning, drinking black coffee without sugar, writing scientific articles, books, lectures. His name appeared in magazines, he was invited to podcasts. He was the center of his universe, and Caitlin was just a satellite orbiting him. She finished her coffee, rinsed her mug, and set it on the draining board. The house was immaculate, not a speck of dust, not a spot. Caitlin liked order, but the cleanliness felt sterile, like a hospital. She walked into the living room, where Robert's books sat on a shelf, his psychology papers, the bindings with his name on them. Her books, novels, and poetry gathered dust below. She hadn't opened them in years. The day dragged on. Caitlin turned on the TV, but the news and TV shows didn't grab her. She turned it off and sat on the couch, looking out the window. The neighbor's dog barked somewhere in the distance. She thought about work. Not for the money Robert made enough. For meaning. She wanted to feel needed, not just a shadow in her own home. The idea came suddenly, like a forgotten line from a poem. A library, a place where she could be among books, people, ideas. She remembered the local library downtown, a small building with red brick and big windows. Caitlin had been there a couple of times, borrowing books for a book club. She imagined herself behind the counter, sorting books, helping customers. It wasn't grand, but it was something. Something that was hers. She opened her laptop and found the library's website. The job posting was part-time assistant librarian. The requirements were minimal organization, love of books. Caitlin began filling out the application. Her fingers shook as she typed in her details. She hadn't worked since she quit her job at the gallery before her wedding. But the thought of the library, the sound of pages, the people who would welcome her warmed her. She submitted the application and closed her laptop. Her heart beat a little faster. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had taken a step. A small one, but hers. It was a cool Tuesday morning, with a slight breeze rustling the leaves on the trees along the street leading to the center of town. Caitlin Rose stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, examining her reflection. She had chosen a simple white short-sleeved blouse and a navy pencil skirt that showed off her figure without being too flashy. She had pulled her hair into a neat low bun, leaving a few strands of hair at her temples to soften the look. Today was her first day at the city library, and she wanted to look professional without being too formal. Caitlin slipped on a pair of lightweight low-heeled shoes, grabbed her bag, and walked out of the house, closing the door with a little more force than was necessary. The lock clicked shut, and she felt her heart clench slightly with excitement. The walk to the library took 5 minutes. Caitlin decided to walk, wanting to breathe in the fresh air and feel the city waking up. The Boston suburbs were quiet at this hour. The school buses had already left, and the office workers had long since gone to their errands. She passed the coffee shop where she usually met Linda and noticed that the window was decorated with autumn pumpkins, even though it was still far from October. Caitlin smiled at the corners of her lips, loving the way the city was preparing for the changing seasons, even if she had long since stopped noticing such details. The library was in the center of town, an old red brick building with large arched windows. Above the entrance hung a sign in faded gold letters, Westbrook City Library. Caitlin paused at the door, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and took a deep breath. She still couldn't believe that her application had been accepted so quickly. Her interview had been the previous week, a quick chat with Mrs. Edwards, the elderly director whose wire-rimmed glasses kept slipping down her nose. Mrs. Edwards had been kind but businesslike. She'd asked simple questions about her love of books and her organizational skills, and then, as if she'd decided the whole thing in a minute, she'd said, "You're a good fit, Miss Rose. Will you start Tuesday?" Caitlin had nodded, before she'd even realized that she'd just gotten the job. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and walked in. It smelled of old paper and wood and something elusively cozy, like her grandmother's house where she'd spent summers as a child. The foyer was spacious, with a high ceiling and oak shelves that reached all the way to the top. Light poured in through the windows, casting soft shadows on the floor. A young woman with short red hair sat at the front desk, leafing through a magazine. She looked up when she spotted Caitlin and smiled. "You must be Caitlin Rose?" she asked, standing up. "I'm Emma, Mrs. Edwards's assistant. She asked me to show you around and fill you in." "Yes, it's me," Caitlin replied, trying to sound confident. "Nice to meet you, Emma." Likewise, Emma stepped out from behind the counter and extended her hand. Her palm was warm, and her handshake was surprisingly strong for such a fragile-looking girl. "Come on, I'll show you where everything is. This isn't a palace, but it's easy to get lost." Emma led Caitlin through the main room, where there were long tables with green lamps and several readers already leafing through books or working on laptops. She showed them the fiction section, the nonfiction section, the children's corner with its colorful pillows, and the periodical rack. Caitlin listened carefully, trying to memorize the layout of the sections and the rules of the room. Her job as a librarian's assistant was simple: sort returned books, help visitors, keep order, and occasionally work the front desk. It was nothing complicated, but Caitlin felt her shoulders relax with each step. It was peaceful, and she liked the peace. "And this is our warehouse," Emma said, opening the door to a small room off the main hall. "This is where we keep books that are waiting to be repaired or sorted. And oh, there's Sam. He's our intern, helps with the heavy boxes and stuff." Caitlin looked where Emma was pointing. At the far wall, next to a tall bookcase, stood a young man, unpacking books from a cardboard box. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with dark hair that was slightly tousled and broad shoulders that stretched the fabric of his black t-shirt. He turned at the sound of Emma's voice, and Caitlin noticed his face. Sharp features, dark eyes, a light stubble on his chin. He looked older than his years, but there was a youthful energy in his movements. "Sam, this is Caitlin, our new assistant," Emma introduced. "Caitlin, this is Samuel Buckley, but everyone calls him Sam." "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Rose," Sam said, coming closer. His voice was low, slightly husky, and he extended his hand. Caitlin shook it, noticing that his palm was warm and slightly rough, like a man accustomed to physical labor. "Just Caitlin," she replied, smiling. "Nice to meet you, Sam." He nodded, a small smile appearing on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. He looked at her a little longer than necessary, and Caitlin felt her cheeks warm slightly. She quickly looked away, pretending to look at the box of books. "Sam's a jack of all trades," Emma continued, oblivious to the moment. "He's only been here a couple of months, but he already knows the library better than I do. If there's something heavy that needs lifting or a shelf that needs fixing, he's your man." "I'm trying," Sam said modestly, returning to the box. "If you need help, Caitlin, just say so." "Thank you," she replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm still learning, so I'll probably ask often." "No problem." He glanced at her again, briefly but attentively, before returning to his work. Emma led Caitlin on, explaining how the cataloging system worked. Caitlin listened, but her thoughts kept returning to Sam. There was something about the way he carried himself, confidence mixed with a certain reserve, as if he was used to being careful. She brushed it aside, deciding that she was just nervous about being in a new place. The rest of the morning was spent learning. Emma showed them how to scan barcodes, how to register new readers, and how to use the old printer that she said was kinky. Caitlin tried to remember everything, but her mind still wandered. She thought about home, about Robert, how he was probably speaking to a room full of people hanging on his every word. She pictured him in a sharp suit, with his usual easy smile, and felt a pang of loneliness. He hadn't called this morning, even though he'd promised. She pushed the thought away, focusing on Emma's words. By midday, Emma had left her at the front desk to answer a call from Mrs. Edwards's office. Caitlin sat alone, staring at the computer screen, which displayed a list of returned books. There weren't many readers. An older woman was looking up Agatha Christie mysteries, and a student was typing on a laptop in the corner. Caitlin felt a little out of place, but at the same time she liked being here. It was new, alive, not like her empty home. She heard footsteps and looked up. Sam walked up to the counter, carrying a stack of books. He set them down next to her and began scanning barcodes, entering data into the system. "A lot of returns?" Caitlin asked, breaking the silence. "Not really," he replied, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Mornings are usually quiet. There will be more people in the evening, especially students." "Are you studying?" she asked, just to keep the conversation going. "Yes, at Boston College, freshman year." He looked at her. "History and literature, but I'm not sure yet if it's for me." "Literature?" Caitlin perked up. "I studied it too." "What are you reading?" "Now," he thought, putting another book on the stack. "Rereading Moby Dick. Melville, he's complicated, but there's something about him that grabs you." "Oh, I love Melville," Caitlin said, feeling her voice grow more vivid. "Especially his language. It's like he paints with words." Sam nodded, his smile a little warmer this time. "Exactly. Sometimes it seems that he wrote not for the readers, but for himself, as if he didn't care whether they understood him or not." "That's what makes it special," Caitlin agreed. "Do you only read the classics?" "Not really," he shrugged. "Sometimes I take something modern, but the classics are more reliable." "And you? What do you read?" Caitlin hesitated. She didn't want to admit that it had been a long time since she'd opened a book, other than cooking magazines or the odd novel she picked up at the supermarket. "Not much lately," she said honestly, "but I used to love poetry. Emily Dickinson, Whitman. There's something real about them." Poetry is brave, Sam said, and there was respect in his voice. I've tried, but I can't get into it. Too much feeling in too few words. Caitlin laughed, and the sound was unexpectedly light. It's really not easy, but sometimes one word can say more than a whole page. Sam looked at her, and this time his gaze lingered a little longer. There was nothing revealing about it, but Caitlin felt a slight tension, as if the air between them had grown thicker. She cleared her throat, looking away, and picked up a book from the stack to keep her hands occupied. Is this a detective story? She asked, looking at the cover. Yeah, Sam went back to work. Mrs. Clark, the one this morning, she loves them. She gets 3 a week. Seriously? Caitlin raised her eyebrows. Does she have time to read that much? Apparently so, he chuckled. She says detective stories help her not to get bored. Her husband died a couple of years ago, so books are probably her way of coping. Caitlin nodded, feeling a small pang in her chest. She knew what loneliness was, though her situation was different. Robert was alive, healthy, and successful. But his absence, his detachment, made her life like Mrs. Clark's empty, save for the small rituals. Why do you work here? She asked to change the subject. There are probably more interesting places for a student. Sam shrugged, scanning another book. I need money, and that's easy. Plus, I love books. And Mrs. Edwards doesn't pick on me if I'm 5 minutes late. That's a plus, Caitlin agreed, smiling. What do you do when you're not here? I study, read, sometimes meet with friends, he answered casually, but then added, I also run. It helps clear my head. Running, Caitlin looked at him with interest. Where? In the park by the river. There's a good path there, and the view is nice. I used to run too, she said, remembering her morning runs before marriage. But then somehow, I stopped. Why? Sam asked, his tone genuinely curious. Caitlin hesitated. She didn't want to tell how her life had gradually come to be about the house, about routine, about waiting for Robert. Instead, she shrugged. There's not enough time, I guess. Sam nodded as if he accepted the answer, but Caitlin sensed he understood more than she had said. He finished the stack of books and carried them to the cart for sorting. If you want to get back into running, let me know, he said over his shoulder. I can show you a couple of good routes. Maybe I'll think about it, she answered, trying to make her voice sound light. The rest of the day was spent working. Caitlin helped Emma sort books, learned how to work the catalog, and even served a few readers. She liked the feeling of being busy, even if it was a simple one. She felt useful, part of something bigger than her own home. Sam showed up every now and then, bringing boxes or helping move shelves. He was polite every time, but there was something about his manner that made Caitlin feel seen. Not as a housewife, not as someone's wife, but as a person. By the end of her shift, she was tired, but it was a pleasant tiredness. Emma had said goodbye, saying she would see her tomorrow, and Mrs. Edwards had praised her for her first day. Caitlin left the library as the sun was setting. She paused on the porch, breathing in the cool air. Her phone vibrated a text from Robert. Arrived, all good, tired, call tomorrow. Caitlin read it and put the phone in her bag. She had expected disappointment, but instead she felt a strange sense of relief. She had done something for herself today, and that was more important than his short messages. She went home, but her thoughts were not of Robert. They were of the library, of the books, of her conversation with Sam. There was something about his quiet confidence, his attentive gaze, that made her feel alive. She dismissed the thought as just the novelty of the first day, but somewhere deep down she knew that this day had changed something inside her, even if it was subtle. The light in the library was soft and diffuse, coming from large windows that looked out onto an old oak tree in the courtyard. Caitlin sat at the front desk, sorting through a stack of returned books. Her second week at Westbrook City Library had started quietly, but something was bubbling inside her, a mix of excitement and anticipation she couldn't quite explain. The work wasn't difficult. Scanning barcodes, checking entries in the system, putting books into carts for sorting. But each day brought something new, a conversation with a reader, an unexpected find among old books, or, like today, a quick glance from Sam that made her heart skip a beat. Caitlin tried not to think about him. Samuel Buckley, the intern, was just a boy, 17 years her junior. He was polite, reserved, sometimes too serious for his age, but there was something about his manner that drew her attention. Maybe it was his confidence, not the kind that bordered on arrogance, but a quiet, almost imperceptible one, as if he knew his place in the world but wasn't trying to prove it. Or the way he looked at her not just as a colleague, but as someone whose presence mattered. Caitlin brushed the thoughts away, but they kept coming back like pesky flies that couldn't be shooed away. The library was busier than usual today. A group of students had taken up tables in the reading room, preparing for a project, and several older patrons were wandering the shelves, choosing books. Caitlin finished scanning a stack of novels and looked up, noticing Sam carrying a box of books from the stacks. He moved easily despite the weight of the load and set the box down on the floor next to the counter. "New arrivals," he said, wiping his palm on his jeans. "Mrs. Edwards asked me to sort them out by the end of the day. They're mostly science fiction, but there are a couple of fiction books, too." "Okay," Caitlin nodded, opening the box. "I'll start sorting. Will you help?" "Sure." He sat on the edge of the table, watching her pull out the first book, a thick tome on quantum physics. "I didn't think anyone in Westbrook read that." "It's amazing, isn't it?" Caitlin replied, smiling. "I thought they only took detective stories and novels here." "Oh, there are novels too." Sam pulled out a book with a colorful cover that showed a couple in a passionate embrace. "Look, this one. Love at Sunset. Sounds like something Mrs. Clark would devour in an evening." Caitlin laughed, taking the book from his hands. Their fingers brushed accidentally, and she felt a slight jolt, like static electricity running through her skin. She quickly pulled her hand away, pretending to focus on the book, but her cheeks were betrayingly warm. Sam didn't seem to notice, already digging through the box, pulling out the next volume. "You read that stuff?" he asked, without looking up. There was a slight mockery in his voice, but no malice. "No," Caitlin answered, trying to sound casual. "I'm more of a classic reader. Jane Austen, Bront. Although, I admit, sometimes I want something light, to give my brain a rest." "I see," he nodded, laying the books out in a neat pile. "Sometimes I pick up comics. Not exactly literature, but it helps me switch off." "Comics?" Caitlin looked at him in surprise. "I didn't expect it. What kind?" "Mostly the old ones," Sam said, enthusiasm flashing in his eyes. "Batman, Watchmen. There's something honest about them. Heroes trying to do the right thing, even when the odds are stacked against them." "That sounds like a good metaphor for life," Caitlin said, and immediately regretted her words. They sounded too serious, almost intimate. She quickly added, "I mean, we all feel like superheroes sometimes, right?" Sam looked at her, his lips twitching into a slight smile. "Maybe so," he said, "but without a cloak and mask, unfortunately." Caitlin smiled back, feeling the tension between them grow just a little more noticeable. She turned to the box to hide her embarrassment and began pulling out books, sorting them into categories. Sam worked nearby, and their movements were almost in sync, him handing her books, her placing them on the cart. At one point, he handed her a heavy encyclopedia, and their hands touched again. This time, his fingers lingered on her palm a little too long, and Caitlin felt her pulse quicken. She looked up and met his gaze, dark and intent, with something she couldn't decipher. "Sorry," he said, removing his hand, but his voice was calm, without a hint of awkwardness. "Nothing," Caitlin said, too quickly. She turned away, concentrating on her book, but her mind was racing. Was it an accident, or had he deliberately delayed his touch? She felt silly, like a schoolgirl blushing over nothing. She was 36 and married, and he was barely more than a teenager. But this feeling, the warmth spreading through her body, the tingling in her fingertips was so new, so real, that she couldn't ignore it. "Are you okay?" Sam asked, interrupting her thoughts. He stood with his arms crossed, looking at her with mild concern. Yeah, it's okay. Caitlin forced a smile. Just thinking. About what? He tilted his head, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. Caitlin hesitated. She couldn't tell the truth what she thought of his touch, how his presence made her feel different. Instead, she said, about how weird it is to be here, I mean to work. I haven't done anything so new in a long time. I see, Sam said, his tone softer than usual. Sometimes you need a change to feel alive. His words touched something inside her. She looked at him, trying to figure out if he had said it by accident or if he knew how much it would affect her. But his face was calm, almost impenetrable, and she could not read anything in his eyes. Do you often change things in your life? She asked to hide her excitement. Sometimes, he shrugged. Moved here from Providence a couple years ago. I went to college. I started working here. Not that I was looking for change, but it just comes. Providence? Caitlin raised her eyebrows. What was there? Nothing much, he said, a hint of shadow creeping into his voice. Mom, school, normal life. But I wanted something more. Boston seemed like a good place to start. Caitlin nodded, sensing that he didn't want to go into the matter further. She didn't press him, though her curiosity was growing. Who was he? Why did someone so young seem so adult? She pushed the thoughts away and returned to her books. They worked in silence for several minutes, but the silence wasn't awkward. There was something calming about their work together, the rhythm they'd created without even realizing it. Caitlin noticed that Sam glanced at her occasionally, but every time she caught him looking, he quickly looked away, as if he didn't want her to notice. It made her feel both vulnerable and strangely significant. By midday, the library had quieted down. The students had gone to lunch, and the older patrons had gone home. Emma, who had been running between the library and Mrs. Edwards's office all day, announced that she was going to the coffee shop for a latte and asked if they wanted anything. I'll have black coffee, Sam said, not looking up from the box. And you, Caitlin? Emma looked at her. Espresso, please, Caitlin replied. No sugar. Oh, that's a serious choice. Emma winked and left, leaving them alone. Caitlin felt a slight tension when they were alone. She tried to concentrate on her work, but her thoughts kept returning to Sam. He was so close enough that she could smell his cologne, something woody and subtle. She found herself sneaking glances at his hands as he rearranged the books. They were strong, with long fingers and barely noticeable calluses, not the hands of a student who did nothing but read. Are you always this quiet? He asked suddenly, interrupting her thoughts. Caitlin flinched as if she had been caught off guard. No, she answered, trying to hide her embarrassment. Just getting used to the new place. You're doing well, he said, and his voice was sincere. It doesn't look like your first day. Thank you, Caitlin smiled, feeling her cheeks warm again. Although I'm still afraid I'll do something wrong. The system here isn't the easiest. Oh, come on, he waved his hand. If anything, I'll tell you. I was confused myself the first couple of weeks. Really? She looked at him in surprise. You look like you were born with a catalog in your hands. Sam laughed, and his laugh was low, warm, almost infectious. It's just an appearance, he said. In reality, I'm just good at pretending. Caitlin was about to answer, but at that moment he reached for another book, and his hand touched hers again. This time it was not accidental. His fingers lingered slightly on her wrist, as if he wanted to get her attention. She froze, feeling her pulse pounding somewhere in her throat. Sam looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, not just curiosity, but something deeper, almost dangerous. I'm sorry, he said, but his voice was quieter than before, and he didn't remove his hand right away. I didn't mean to. It's okay, Caitlin said, but her voice was shaking. She pulled her hand away, pretending to straighten the stack of books, but her heart was pounding so loudly she was afraid he'd hear it. Sam turned away as if nothing had happened and continued sorting books. But Caitlin felt something had changed. That touch, his look, his words, it was like a spark that ignited something inside her. She felt alive for the first time in years. Not just Robert's wife, not just a housewife, but a woman who was noticed, seen. She tried to concentrate on her work, but her thoughts were racing. She remembered Robert touching her, rarely, almost mechanically, as if it were part of his job. His touch was familiar, habitual, but it evoked nothing more than a slight yearning. And this was different. It was like an awakening. Caitlin, Sam's voice brought her back to reality. He was standing there, holding a book with a tattered cover. You might like this. Dickinson, a collection of poems. She took the book, trying not to look him in the eye. Thank you, she said quietly. I'll take a look. If anything, I can bring you some more, he said, and there was a slight mockery in his voice, but no malice. We have a whole warehouse of poetry here. I'll think about it, she replied, smiling. Her fingers still remembered the warmth of his hand, and she didn't know what to do with it. She was shocked by her own reaction, by the way her body responded to his gaze, to his voice, to his casual touch. It was wrong, it was dangerous, but at the same time, it was the only thing that made her feel alive. The rest of the day passed in a strange tension. They worked side by side, exchanging short sentences, but every time their eyes met, Caitlin felt her heart tighten. She tried to convince herself that it meant nothing, that it was just her imagination, but deep down she knew it wasn't. Something had started, and she wasn't sure if she wanted it to end. When her shift ended, Caitlin gathered her things and walked out onto the library steps. Sam had left early, saying he had classes at college. She stood there, looking at the sunset, trying to figure out what was happening to her. Her phone vibrated, a text from Robert. Busy, conference ran late. Call tomorrow. She read it and put the phone away, not feeling the usual disappointment. Instead, she thought about Sam, about his touch, about the way he looked at her. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel empty. Caitlin sat in the small staff room at the back of the library, nursing a cup of herbal tea. It was the middle of her third week on the job, and she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the place. The rustle of pages, the hushed voices of readers, the creak of the trolley of books as Sam pushed it around. It was a quiet day, with few visitors, and Caitlin was enjoying the break, allowing herself to relax. Emma had gone to lunch and Mrs. Edwards was busy in her office, so Caitlin was alone in the common room, leafing through an old magazine she had found on the desk. Her thoughts, as they often did lately, were turning to Sam. Their interactions had become routine over the past few weeks, but not without the slight tension she had first felt the day they met. Sam was polite, sometimes joking, but his glances, his occasional touches, all of it left a mark on her mind. Caitlin was angry with herself for thinking these thoughts. She was married, her husband was a famous psychologist, a man respected by hundreds of people. But Robert was far away on yet another business trip, and his rare messages, short, almost formal, only increased her sense of loneliness. Sam, on the other hand, was here, next to her, and his presence, his voice, his attention made her feel visible. She put the magazine down and stood up, determined to do something useful. In the corner of the room stood an old cabinet where the employees kept their personal belongings, jackets, bags, a couple of umbrellas. Caitlin noticed that the cabinet door was slightly open and decided to close it. But when she pulled the handle, a small cardboard box fell out of the cabinet, landing on the floor with a dull thud. Caitlin bent down to pick it up and noticed that the lid had popped off, and the contents, a few photographs, a notebook, and some small items were scattered across the floor. Shit, she muttered, kneeling to gather her things. She didn't want anyone to accuse her of going through someone else's things. The photos were old, slightly yellowed at the edges. One showed a woman in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back into a low ponytail and a smile that seemed both warm and tired. Next to her stood a teenager, tall and thin, with dark eyes. Caitlin recognized him immediately. Sam. He looked younger, maybe 16, but it was him. She turned the photo over and saw the writing on the back. Diana and Sam, Providence, 2021. The name Diana sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. She picked up another photograph, this one of the same woman, Diana, sitting in a cafe with a man. His face was partially hidden in shadow, but something about his posture, the way he leaned toward her, made Caitlin freeze. She looked closer, and her heart skipped a beat. It was Robert. Her Robert. Younger, with longer hair than he had now, but it was him, his profile, his bearing. On the back of the photograph was another caption: Diana and Rob, Boston, 2005. Caitlin felt her palms grow clammy. She put the photographs back in the box, but her hands were shaking. Diana, Robert, 2005. It was a year before she met Robert, 2 years before they were married. She knew he'd had relationships before her, he'd mentioned them in passing, never going into detail. But Diana, and Sam, her son? Her thoughts swirled like autumn leaves in the wind. She tried to remember if Robert had ever mentioned a woman named Diana, but her memory was blank. He'd always been reticent about the past, and she hadn't pressed him. Now the silence seemed ominous. Caitlin closed the box and put it back in the cabinet, trying to be quiet. Her heart was pounding, and she could feel the blood rushing to her face. Sam was Diana's son. Diana had been in Robert's life, and now Sam was working here in the library where she, Caitlin, had just started. A coincidence? Or something more? She remembered the way Sam had looked at her, the way his hand lingered on her wrist, the way he had spoken to her always politely, but with an intensity that was hidden. What if he knew who she was? What if he had come here for a reason? She walked back to the front desk, trying to look calm. The reading room was almost empty, just a couple of students whispering in the corner. Caitlin opened the catalog on her computer, but her eyes skimmed the screen, not seeing the words. She tried to put the pieces of the puzzle together. If Sam was Diana's son and Diana was with Robert, then Sam could be. No, that was impossible. Robert had never mentioned children. But then why was Sam here? Why was he looking at her so intently? And why didn't she know anything about Diana? The vault door opened and Sam walked into the room carrying a cart of books. He looked at Caitlin and nodded as usual, but she felt her body tense. She forced a smile, but it came out tight. "A lot of work?" he asked, placing the cart next to the counter. "Not really," Caitlin replied, trying to keep her voice even. "What about you?" "The same as always," he shrugged and began to sort through the books. "Mrs. Edwards wants us to go through the archive magazines. It's dusty, so get ready to sneeze." Caitlin nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She watched him, trying to find something in his face that could connect him to Robert. Those same dark eyes, or the shape of his jaw. She was angry at herself for thinking about it, but she couldn't stop it. Sam noticed her glance and raised his eyebrows. "Is something wrong?" he asked, and there was a slight concern in his voice. "No, it's fine." Caitlin turned away, pretending to check the catalog. "I was just thinking." "About what?" He leaned a little closer, and she could smell him, the same woodsy cologne she'd noticed last week. "About books," she lied. "I'm thinking about which ones to take home." "I can help you choose," Sam said, his voice soft, almost intimate. "We have a couple of rare editions here. Dickinson's letters, for example. You love her, right?" "Yeah," Caitlin nodded, feeling her cheeks grow warm. She hated herself for it. Why was she blushing? Why did his voice make her feel like she was a 20-year-old college student again? And why the hell couldn't she stop thinking about that photo? "I'll get them if you want," Sam said, not looking away. "They're in the vault, but I know where to look." "Thank you," she replied, trying to sound neutral. "But I'll probably take a look at myself later." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her a little too long. Caitlin felt her pulse quicken and quickly looked away, pretending to be busy with her work. Her thoughts were chaotic. What if Sam knew who she was? What if he was here to keep an eye on her? Or was she just being paranoid? She remembered Robert once saying that the past always came back if you didn't let it go. She hadn't thought much of it then, but now his words sounded like a warning. "Sam," she turned to him, deciding to ask the question, "have you been in Boston long?" He looked at her, slightly surprised. "A couple of years," he replied. "Moved from Providence. Why?" "Just curious," Caitlin shrugged, trying to look casual. "You said your mom lives there?" "Yes," he nodded, his face becoming a little more serious. She's still there. I go to see her sometimes, but not often. She has her own life. I see, Caitlin said, feeling her throat tighten. She wanted to ask about Diana, but she didn't know how to do it without giving herself away. What's her name? Your mother. Diana, Sam replied, his voice even, with no hint of concealment. Diana Buckley. Caitlin nodded, trying not to show how the name hit her. She turned to her computer, pretending to check something in the catalog, but her fingers were shaking. Diana Buckley, the woman in the photograph, the woman who had been with Robert. She tried to remember if Robert had ever mentioned that name, but her memory was blank. He had always been so careful, so good at avoiding talking about his past. And now this boy, the woman's son, stood before her, sorting through books and looking at her like he knew more than he was letting on. "What about you?" Sam asked, interrupting her thoughts. "You're from Boston, right?" "Yes," Caitlin answered, trying to compose herself. "Born and raised, although sometimes it seems like I don't know this city as well as I should." "It happens," he said, his voice soft, almost soothing. "Sometimes you have to get out of the house to see what's around you." Caitlin looked at him, and for a second she thought he was talking about something bigger than the city. She felt her heart tighten again, not with fear this time, but with something else, the same feeling she had felt when he touched her arm last week. She quickly looked away, afraid he would notice her confusion. "I'll go get another box," Sam said, standing up. "Call me if anything happens." "Okay," Caitlin replied, but her voice was quieter than she intended. When he was gone, she exhaled, feeling her shoulders relax. Her thoughts were a jumble. Diana Buckley, Robert, Sam. None of this could be a coincidence. She remembered Sam talking about his mother, about Providence, about moving to Boston. What if he knew about Robert? What if he knew she was Robert's wife? And what if his politeness, his glances, his casual touches were all part of some plan? Caitlin tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back like waves washing up on the shore. She remembered Robert once saying that in psychology, there were no accidents, everything had a reason, even if it was hidden. She hated him for saying that, for his habit of analyzing everything as if life were a scientific experiment. But now she couldn't help but think that he was right. Sam wasn't just an intern. He was a part of her past, a part of her life that she knew nothing about. The rest of the day was tense. Caitlin worked mechanically, scanning books, answering readers' questions, but her mind was on the photo, Diana, Robert. She watched Sam, trying to catch something in his behavior that would confirm or deny her suspicions. But he was the same as always, polite, reserved, with a slight smile that appeared when he spoke to her. Caitlin didn't know what was worse, if he really was hiding something or if she herself had imagined this nightmare. When her shift ended, she gathered her things and headed outside. The sky was gray, with heavy clouds promising rain. She pulled out her phone to check her messages, but there was only one from Robert. "Going to be late until Friday. Talk to you when I get back." Caitlin put the phone away, her throat tightening with anger. He hadn't called in 3 days, and his messages were getting shorter. She imagined him in Chicago, in an expensive suit, speaking to a crowd, smiling the same smile that had once captivated her. And then she remembered the photo of him and Diana, their closeness, their past, and of Sam, who perhaps knew more than she could ever imagine. Caitlin walked home, but her steps were heavy, as if she were carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. She felt trapped between her marriage, which was becoming increasingly empty, and this boy who might be part of some secret. She didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. She couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. She needed to know the truth about Diana, about Sam, about Robert, and she was afraid that the truth would change everything. Rain pounded the library's large windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop that blended with the muffled footsteps and occasional voices in the reading room. Caitlin stood at the front desk, absent-mindedly shuffling a stack of returned books. Her mind was elsewhere, somewhere between the photograph of Diana and Robert she'd found last week and her own feelings, which were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Sam was in the stacks, sorting through new arrivals, and Caitlin found herself listening to every sound coming from behind the door, waiting for him to appear. She was angry at herself for waiting, at the way her body reacted to his presence, but she couldn't help it. It was Friday, the end of her third week working at the Westbrook Library. Over the past few days, she'd learned to navigate the catalog system, memorized the names of regulars, and even begun to feel a part of the place. But her thoughts kept returning to Sam, to the way he looked at her, to his casual touches, to the way he spoke to her as if she were the only person in the room, and to her own suspicions nagging at her. Did he know who she was? Was he here because of Robert? Or was this all just her paranoia, fueled by the loneliness and emptiness of her marriage? Emma had gone out to lunch and Mrs. Edwards had left for a meeting with the city council, leaving Caitlin and Sam alone in the library. There were hardly any readers. The rain had kept even the most devoted away. Caitlin was sitting at the counter, leafing through a magazine, when the vault door opened and Sam came out, wiping his hands on his jeans. His dark t-shirt was lightly dusted, and his hair was a little disheveled, as usual. "Bored?" he asked, walking up to the counter and leaning his elbow on it. Caitlin looked up and forced a smile. "A little," she answered, closing the magazine. The rain dispersed everyone. "That's even better," Sam said, looking around the empty room. "We can take a break. Want me to show you something interesting?" "Interesting?" Caitlin raised an eyebrow, feeling her pulse quicken slightly. "What exactly?" "Second floor." He nodded toward a narrow staircase in the corner of the room. "They keep old books there that almost no one takes, but they're special. I think you'll like them." Caitlin hesitated. Her instincts told her that going somewhere with him where they would be alone was not a good idea. But curiosity, mixed with something else she didn't want to name, won out. "Okay," she said, standing up. "But if there's only dust and spiders in there, I won't forgive you." Sam laughed, and his laugh was low, warm, almost infectious. "I promise I chased away the spiders last week," he said, heading for the stairs. "Let's go." Caitlin followed him, feeling her heart beat a little faster. The stairs were narrow, with wooden steps that creaked underfoot. The light on the second floor was dim, coming from a single window at the far end of the hallway. The air smelled of old paper and wood, and the shelves that lined the walls were filled with books in tattered bindings, some of which looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. "Here," Sam said, stopping at one of the shelves. "This is my favorite corner. Look." He pulled out a book bound in dark green leather, with gold lettering that was nearly worn away. Caitlin picked it up, opening it carefully. It was a collection of Walt Whitman poems, published in the 1890s. The pages were brittle, with a slight scent of age, but the text was remarkably well preserved. "It's incredible," Caitlin said quietly, running her finger down the page. "Books like these are like time travel." "That's right," Sam agreed, standing closer than she expected. "Sometimes I come here when things get too much. It's quiet and no one bothers me." Caitlin looked at him, her gaze involuntarily lingering on his face. In the dim light, his eyes seemed darker, his features sharper. He was so close that she could feel the warmth of his body, and it made her freeze. "Do you come here often?" she asked to break the silence. "Sometimes," he shrugged, but didn't back down. "This place is like, outside of time. You can forget about everything here." Caitlin nodded, her throat tightening. She wanted to move away, to put the book back, but her feet were rooted to the floor. Sam was looking at her, and there was something new in his gaze, not just curiosity, but something deeper, almost tangible. "Caitlin," he said quietly, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Have you ever felt like you needed to change something? Not just your job or your city, but something inside?" Her heart skipped a beat. His words had touched something she had tried to ignore for years. She wanted to answer, but her voice caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded, not looking away. "All the time," she said finally, her voice quieter than she'd expected. "But it's not that simple, is it?" "It's not easy," he agreed, his gaze becoming even more intent. "But sometimes it all starts small, with one step. He took a step closer, and Caitlin felt her breathing become ragged. She knew she should pull away, say something to break the tension, but her body wouldn't listen. Sam reached out to take the book she was still holding, and his fingers brushed against hers again, this time deliberately, slowly, as if he were testing her reaction. Caitlin didn't pull away, even though every cell in her body screamed that this was wrong. "Are you always this serious?" he asked, his voice slightly mocking but not malicious. "Or is it just me?" Caitlin felt her cheeks heat up. She wanted to say something witty, but instead she said, "I don't know, Sam. Maybe it's you who makes me be serious." He smiled, and his smile wasn't just warm, there was something almost dangerous about it, as if he knew he'd crossed some line but wasn't going to back down. "Maybe it's not such a bad thing," he said, leaning a little closer. "Sometimes seriousness is a good thing, so you're thinking." Caitlin felt her pulse pounding in her temples. He was so close she could see tiny golden sparks in his dark eyes. The scent of his cologne woody, slightly citrusy wafted around her, and she realized she couldn't breathe. She should have pulled away, told him it was a mistake, that she was married, that he was too young. Instead, she stood there, transfixed by his gaze, his voice, this moment that seemed both impossible and inevitable. "Sam," she began, but her voice was weak, almost pleading. She didn't know if she wanted to say something to stop him or encourage him. He leaned closer, and for a second she thought he was going to kiss her. His breath brushed her cheek, warm and subtle, and she felt her body respond, as if awakening from a long sleep. But then something inside her snapped panic, guilt, fear. She pulled away abruptly, placing a hand on his chest to stop him. "No," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "We can't." Sam froze, his eyes still locked on her face. He didn't look hurt or surprised, but rather a mixture of understanding and something Caitlin couldn't decipher. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to overstep my bounds." Caitlin shook her head, trying to collect her thoughts. Her heart was pounding and her palms were clammy. She could still feel the warmth of his breath, his closeness, and it scared her. But she didn't leave. She couldn't. Instead, she stood there, looking at him, as if trying to understand what had just happened. "It's not your fault," she said finally, her voice shaking. It's difficult." "I understand," Sam said, his tone gentle, without a hint of pressure. "I didn't mean to embarrass you." Caitlin nodded, unsure of what to say. She felt torn between a desire she didn't want to acknowledge and the guilt that washed over her in waves. She was married. She was older. And yet, standing here in this dimly lit hallway, surrounded by old books, she felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. "Maybe we should go back down," she said, but her voice was uncertain. "If you want," Sam said, but he didn't move. He looked at her, and there was something in his gaze that made her heart clench. "But if you want to talk, or just sit here, that's fine with me." Caitlin looked at him, and for a second she wanted to stay. Just be here with him, in this quiet place where no one could find them. But she knew it was dangerous. Not just for Robert, not just for her suspicions about Diana and her husband's past. It was dangerous for herself, for the part of her that had been asleep for so long and was now waking up, demanding attention. I have to go," she said finally, turning toward the stairs. But her steps were slow, almost reluctant. She could feel his gaze on her back, and it made her skin burn. When she went down to the main hall, he stayed upstairs. Caitlin sat at the counter, trying to focus on her work, but her mind was in chaos. She had almost kissed him, or he had kissed her. She wasn't sure who had made the first move, but it didn't matter. What mattered was how she felt, alive, wanted, and scared too, because this moment had changed something inside her, and she didn't know how to live with it. The rain was still pounding the windows, and Caitlin watched the drops slide down the glass, trying to figure out what to do next. She knew she couldn't just forget this moment, but she also knew she couldn't let it happen again. Or could she? The rain had stopped, leaving behind damp air and puddles on the sidewalks that reflected the dim light of the streetlights. Caitlin walked home from the library, her steps quick, almost hurried, as if she were trying to escape her own thoughts. The events on the second floor of the library, the moment when she and Sam had almost kissed, still burned in her memory like a fresh burn. She felt torn, with guilt washing over her in waves, and a strange, terrifying excitement she couldn't suppress. Her body still remembered the warmth of his breath, his gaze, his light touch, and it scared her more than she cared to admit. The house greeted her with its usual silence. Caitlin took off her coat, hung it on the rack by the door, and walked into the kitchen. There was a note from Robert on the table, back, in the office, tired. He had flown in from Chicago that afternoon, but hadn't called to let her know. Caitlin looked at the note, irritation rising in her chest. She had expected his return to bring relief, that his presence would help her forget about Sam, about the library, about what had happened. But instead, she felt even more alone. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, looking at the immaculate kitchen. Everything was in its place: the white cabinets, the marble countertop, the ceramic mug with the words "Best Wife" written on it sitting on the draining board. This house that had once seemed like a dream come true now felt like a cage, a beautiful, comfortable one, but still a cage. Caitlin finished her water and headed into Robert's office, deciding that she needed to see him, to talk to him, to feel like they were still a couple, that her life wasn't falling apart. The office door was ajar. Robert was sitting at his desk, staring at his laptop. His jacket was hanging over the back of his chair, and his shirt was slightly wrinkled. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, a light stubble on his chin. Caitlin knocked on the doorframe to get his attention. "Hello," she said, trying to keep her voice warm. "You're back." Robert looked up and nodded, but his smile was weak, almost mechanical. "Yes, just now," he replied, returning to the screen. "The conference was exhausting. I still need to finalize the presentation for next week." Caitlin felt a twinge of disappointment, but swallowed it. She walked into the office, stopping at the desk. "How did it go?" she asked, although she knew he didn't like to talk about work in detail. "Okay," he replied, not looking up from his laptop. "Lots of questions, lots of ideas, but honestly, I just want to sleep." She nodded, feeling her resolve begin to melt. She had come here with an intention not just to talk, but to reclaim something she felt they had lost. She wanted to feel wanted, needed, not just a shadow in his life. Caitlin took a step closer, placing her hand on the back of his chair. "Maybe you should take a break," she asked, her voice soft, with a playful edge she hadn't used in a long time. "We could spend time together." Robert finally looked up from the screen and at her, his gaze tired, almost absent. "Kate, I'm really exhausted," he said, rubbing his temples. "Let's do it tomorrow, okay? I'm not in the mood right now." Her heart sank, but she forced herself to smile. "Of course," she replied, stepping back. "Rest." She walked out of the office, closing the door behind her. There was a lump in her throat, and a feeling she couldn't quite place was growing in her chest, a mixture of hurt, shame, and anger. She wanted him to notice her, to want her, like in those early years when his gaze had made her feel like the center of the universe. But instead, he looked at her like a colleague with whom he needed to discuss his schedule. Caitlin walked into the living room, sat on the couch, and closed her eyes, trying to calm herself. She felt stupid, humiliated, as if her attempt to seduce her own husband had been ridiculous and unnecessary. Her thoughts returned to Sam, to that moment on the second floor of the library, to his closeness, to the way her body had responded to his gaze. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't deny that he made her feel alive. Not just Robert's wife, not just a housewife, but a woman someone saw, wanted, noticed. She stood up, trying to push the thoughts away, and went to the bookcase in the corner of the living room. Her gaze fell on the shelf of Robert's books, his psychology works neatly lined up. She had never read them, finding them too academic, too far removed from her world. But today she needed something to help her understand not just Robert, but herself. She pulled out one of his books, Relationship Dynamics, The Psychology of Intimacy. The cover was simple, with his name in stark font. Caitlin opened the book and began flipping through it. The introduction was filled with terms: emotional availability, attachment patterns, power dynamics. She frowned, trying to take it all in. Robert wrote about how people form relationships, how they lose connection, how their desires and fears shape intimacy. Caitlin stopped at a chapter called Identity Crisis in Marriage. She began to read, and every word felt like a mirror reflecting her own life. When one partner loses their sense of self-worth, Robert wrote, it creates a vacuum that is filled either by external stimuli or by internal conflict. Often this leads to a search for validation outside the marriage, not necessarily in the form of infidelity, but in the form of an emotional or intellectual connection with another person. Caitlin closed the book, feeling her cheeks burn. It was about her loneliness, about her job at the library, about Sam. She stood up and began pacing the room, trying to calm the rising panic. She didn't want to cheat on Robert. She loved him, or at least loved the man he'd once been. But something had changed, and she didn't know how to fix it. She felt lost, like her life was a book written by someone else, and she didn't know how to rewrite the ending. She returned to the book, deciding that reading was better than sitting and drowning in her thoughts. She opened to another chapter, titled Emotional Distance and Its Consequences. Robert wrote about how partners grew distant when one of them was too focused on a career or external achievements. As Caitlin read, every word cut her like a knife. She remembered the way Robert had looked at her today, tired, indifferent. She remembered how he had rejected her attempts to get closer, not even trying to hide the fact that he was not interested. And she remembered Sam, his look, his voice, his words that made her feel alive. Caitlin closed the book and leaned back on the couch. Her thoughts were a mess. She felt guilty about what had happened in the library, about letting Sam get so close. But she also felt angry at Robert for being cold, for being absent, for leaving her alone in this empty house, and at herself for not being able to just accept her life as it was. She stood up, deciding she couldn't sit still any longer. She went into her bedroom, opened her closet, and pulled out a box of her old things: diaries, letters, photographs. She hadn't opened it in years, but now she needed something to remind her of who she was before Robert, before this house, before this feeling of emptiness. She found an old journal she'd kept at university and began leafing through it. The pages were filled with her dreams, her thoughts of books, of travel, of a meaningful life. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read. Where was the girl who'd written these words? How had she become a woman afraid of her own desires? Caitlin closed the journal and looked out the window. The darkness beyond the glass was thick, almost tangible. She knew that tomorrow she would return to the library, she would see Sam, and it would all start over again: this tension, this attraction, this fight with herself. She didn't know how to stop it, and worse, she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop it. She went to bed, but she couldn't sleep. Instead, she lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Robert's book, about her own feelings, about Sam. She felt like she was on the edge, between who she was and who she could be. And that edge was both terrifying and inviting, like the light at the end of a tunnel. Caitlin sat at the kitchen table, staring at her empty coffee cup. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the marble countertop. The house was quiet, as usual, but today the silence felt oppressive rather than comforting, like the harbinger of a conversation she had been putting off for too long. Robert was home for the second day since returning from Chicago, but his presence was barely more noticeable than his absence. He spent his time in his office, staring at his laptop or answering calls, his voice echoing through the house but not directed at her. Caitlin felt her resolve grow stronger with each hour of silence. She needed to talk about Diana, about the photo, about Sam. She couldn't live with the questions that were burning inside her any longer. The previous evening, when she had tried to get closer to Robert, had left a bitter taste in her mouth. His indifference, his tired eyes, his refusal to even acknowledge her attempts, all of it had only added to her confusion. She felt invisible, unwanted, and this feeling was mixed with guilt for what had happened on the second floor of the library with Sam. That almost kiss still burned in her memory, like a coal that smolders but does not go out. She hated herself for allowing it to happen, but she hated Robert even more for the fact that his coldness had pushed her to it. And now, with the photo of Diana and Robert in her head, she could no longer remain silent. Caitlin stood up, rinsed her cup, and set it on the drying rack. She adjusted her hair, which was pulled back into a low bun, and took a deep breath, steeling herself. Robert was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in his hands, not one of his own, but a paperback mystery. This was unusual. He rarely read anything other than nonfiction. Caitlin paused in the doorway, watching him. His posture was relaxed, but there was something tense in the set of his shoulders, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. "Robert," she began, her voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." He looked up from his book, his eyebrows raising slightly. He set the book down on the coffee table and nodded. "Of course," he said, his tone as even as ever, but Caitlin noticed his fingers tighten slightly on the arm of the couch. "About what?" She walked into the living room and sat down in the chair opposite him. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to keep her back straight, her eyes steady. She didn't want him to see her uncertainty. "About Diana," she said, watching his reaction. Robert froze. It was subtle, a slight tension at the corners of his mouth, a momentary widening of his pupils, but Caitlin, who had known him for more than a decade, caught it. He quickly composed himself, his face becoming inscrutable again. "Diana?" he asked, his voice neutral, but with a hint of wariness. "How do you know that name?" "I found a picture," Caitlin said, trying to keep her voice calm, even as her fingers fiddled nervously with the hem of her sweater. "In the library. You and her in a coffee shop. Boston, 2005. Robert frowned, his gaze hardening. He leaned back on the couch, crossing his arms. "Have you been going through other people's things?" he asked, and there was something like an accusation in his voice. Caitlin felt irritation rise within her. She had expected him to be evasive, but his tone had stung. "It was an accident," she said, her voice sharpening. "The box fell and I saw it. But that's not important. What's important is that you never mentioned her. Who is she, Robert?" He sighed, rubbing his temples as if the conversation had already tired him. Caitlin knew the gesture. He used it when he wanted to avoid difficult topics. But today, she wasn't going to back down. "Diana. It was a long time ago," he said finally, his voice quieter but tense. "We dated briefly before you. It was stupid. Nothing serious." "Stupid?" Caitlin raised her eyebrows, her tone sarcastic. "You didn't look like it was stupid in that picture. You were sitting close. You were smiling. You never told me about it." Robert looked at her, a shadow of irritation flickering in his eyes. "Kate, that was 20 years ago," he said, his voice growing a little louder. "Why are you digging into this? What do you want to hear?" "The truth," she replied, not looking away. "I want to know who she was to you. And why does her son work in the library where I now work?" Robert froze, and this time his reaction was obvious. His face went pale, and his fingers on the armrest clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. Caitlin felt her heart skip a beat. She had hit the nail on the head. He knew about Sam, and it wasn't an accident. "A son?" he asked again, his voice cautious, as if he were buying time. "What son?" "Samuel Buckley," Caitlin said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "He's an intern at the library. I saw him in a picture with Diana, and I know you were with her. So don't lie to me, Robert. What's going on?" He looked away, looking off to the side at the bookcase. His jaw was tense, and Caitlin could see him struggling with his words. She waited, feeling her patience growing thinner with each passing second. "I didn't know he worked there," he said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper. I haven't seen Diana in years, and I didn't know her son was in Boston." "You didn't know?" Caitlin leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You want me to believe that this is just a coincidence? That your ex-lover's son just happened to be in the library where I work?" "Kate," Robert looked at her, and there was something pleading in his eyes. "I'm not lying. It was a long time ago. Diana was a mistake. We dated for a few months, and it was over long before I met you. I didn't even know she had a son." "But you knew her," Caitlin insisted, her voice growing louder. "You knew her well enough to sit with her in a cafe, to smile at her, to hold her hand. And you never told me about it. Why?" Robert sighed, his shoulders slumping as if he was giving up. "Because it didn't matter," he said. "That was in the past. I didn't want you to think, to worry. You always think too much anyway." Caitlin felt her cheeks heat up with anger. His words, his tone, it was all so familiar. He always did this, deflect the conversation onto her overthinking, as if her feelings were the problem and not his secrets. "Don't make me sound stupid," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not just thinking too much. I can see how nervous you are. I can see that you're hiding something, and I want to know what it is." Robert looked at her, and for a second she thought he was about to say something important. But instead he stood up, walked to the window, and stood looking out at the street. "Kate, I don't know what you want from me," he said, his voice weary. "Yes, I dated Diana. Yes, that was before you, but I don't know why her son works in your library. That's not my story. It has nothing to do with me." Caitlin stared at his back, her anger mixing with despair. She wanted to believe him, wanted it all to be a coincidence. But his nervousness, his evasive answers, his refusal to meet her eyes, all of it told a different story. She remembered Sam, his looks, his touches, that almost kiss on the second floor. And now, looking at Robert, she began to suspect that Sam was more than just a random intern. What if he knew who she was? What if he was there for a reason? "Are you sure you don't know anything about Sam?" she asked, her voice quieter but still steely. "Because if I find out you're lying, Robert, it'll be the end." He turned to face her, and a spark flashed in his eyes, not anger, but something else, fear perhaps. "I'm not lying," he said, but his voice was too even, too rehearsed. "I don't know any Sam, and I don't know why you're so fixated on it." Caitlin stood up, her hands shaking. She wanted to scream, wanted to make him tell her the truth, but she knew he wouldn't give in. Not now. She turned and walked out of the living room without another word, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway as she made her way up to the bedroom. She closed the door and leaned against it, tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Caitlin sat on the bed, looking at her hands. She remembered the photograph Robert and Diana, close, smiling. And Sam, his dark eyes, so like Robert's when he was younger. She couldn't prove that Sam was there for a reason, but her gut was screaming at her that it wasn't. She remembered Robert talking about the past, how it always came back if you didn't let it go. And now she was afraid that that past was standing between them, in the form of the young intern who was looking at her as if he knew more than he was letting on. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts swirled like leaves in an autumn wind. She wanted the truth, but she was afraid of it. What if Sam was Robert's son? What if he knew who she was, and his flirting, his closeness, were part of some plan? Or worse, what if it was all just her imagination, and she was ruining her marriage because of her own fears? Caitlin closed her eyes, feeling the weariness wash over her. She knew that tomorrow she would go to the library again, she would see Sam again, and that tension, that mixture of attraction and suspicion, would return. But she also knew that she couldn't continue to live in ignorance. She needed to know the truth about Diana, about Sam, about Robert, and she was willing to do whatever it took to find it. Saturday began with a gray sky, low clouds that seemed to weigh down on the city, making the air heavy and damp. Caitlin woke up late, a rare occurrence for her. She lay in bed, looking at the empty side of the bed where Robert should have been sleeping. He had left early that morning, citing a meeting with a colleague about a new book. Caitlin did not ask questions after their conversation about Diana the night before. She felt like there was a wall between them, cold and impenetrable. His evasive answers, his nervousness, his refusal to look her in the eye, all of it only increased her suspicions. But she did not know how to continue this conversation without destroying what fragile balance remained in their marriage. She stood up, pulled on a light sweater, and went down to the kitchen. The coffee maker hummed, filling the house with its familiar aroma. Caitlin sat at the table, holding her mug in both hands, looking out the window. The neighbor's dog was running around on the lawn, and across the street Mrs. Linda was watering her roses despite the gloomy weather. Caitlin felt disconnected from this world, from this suburb, from this life that had once felt right to her. Her thoughts went back to Sam, to that moment on the second floor of the library, to the way he looked at her, to the way his breath still lingered on her skin. She was angry at herself for thinking these thoughts, but they were stronger than she was. The library was open until 3 today, and Caitlin was getting ready to go by noon. She wore a simple dark green dress that showed off her figure without being too revealing, and pulled her hair back into a loose ponytail. She looked at herself in the hallway mirror, wondering why she was bothering so much. It was just work, just the library. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Sam was there, and his presence made each day both painful and exciting. When she entered the library, it was quiet, as if the rainy weather had discouraged even the most devoted readers. Emma was standing behind the counter, flipping through the catalog on her computer, and Mrs. Edwards was in her office, discussing something on the phone. Sam was nowhere to be seen, and Caitlin felt a slight disappointment mixed with relief. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face him again after what had happened upstairs. "Good morning," Emma said, looking up. "Or rather, afternoon. You're late today." "Yeah, I overslept a little," Caitlin replied, smiling. "What do we have for today?" "Nothing much," Emma shrugged. "Returns a couple of student inquiries. Oh, and Sam asked me to tell you what's coming later. He's helping with some event." "Events?" Caitlin raised her eyebrows. "What?" "Literary evening," Emma explained, her eyes lighting up. "Tonight at 7 at the cafe across the street. There'll be local poets, some readings. Sam's helping with the setup. He's kind of a volunteer there. You should come. It'll be fun." Caitlin felt her heart clench a little. A literary evening. It was so much like what she had loved, evenings full of words, ideas, people sharing their thoughts. But the thought of Sam being there left her with mixed feelings. "I'm not sure," she said, trying to sound casual. "I don't really go to places like that." "Oh, come on," Emma rolled her eyes. "You like books. Plus, there's wine, and Sam said he'd like to see you." Caitlin froze, her fingers tightening on the edge of the counter. Sam wanted her to come. It was both exciting and terrifying. She remembered his look, his words, his closeness, and the photographed Diana, Robert, his evasive answers. She didn't know if she could trust Sam, but the thought of spending an evening in his company, surrounded by words and music, was too tempting. "I'll think about it," she said finally, and Emma smiled, as if she already knew that Caitlin would agree. The rest of the shift was routine. Caitlin sorted books, answered questions from the occasional customer, and helped Emma with the catalog. Sam showed up around 2, carrying a box of some leaflets. He looked his usual self, dark t-shirt, jeans, a light stubble on his chin. But when he saw Caitlin, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Hi," he said, placing the box on the counter. "Did Emma tell you about the evening?" "Yeah," Caitlin nodded, trying not to look him in the eye for too long. "That sounds interesting." "Will you come?" he asked, his voice a mixture of hope and slight mockery. "Or are you too busy?" Caitlin felt her cheeks grow warm. She wanted to say that she had plans, that she couldn't, that this wasn't her place. But instead, she heard herself say, "Maybe, if I don't fall asleep after my shift." Sam laughed, and his laughter was warm, almost infectious. "Then I'll hold a seat for you," he said, his eyes lingering on her a little longer than necessary. "And maybe even coffee. You drink espresso, right?" "Yes," she replied, feeling her lips involuntarily stretch into a smile. "Without sugar." "I remember," he said with a wink, and went into the storage room, leaving her with her heart pounding wildly. Caitlin spent the rest of the day in a turmoil. She tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept returning to Sam, to his invitation, to what it might mean. She knew going to the literary event was a bad idea. She was married, she suspected that Sam might be connected to Robert's past, and yet she couldn't shake the urge to go. It was more than just curiosity. It was a desire to feel alive, wanted, seen, feelings she'd almost forgotten. When her shift ended, Caitlin went home to change. She stood in front of her closet, sorting through dresses she hadn't worn in years. Her hand settled on a navy dress with a low neckline and soft fabric that she had bought for some party with Robert, but had never worn. She put it on, looked in the mirror, and felt different, not a housewife, not the wife of a famous psychologist, but a woman who could still turn heads. She let her hair fall loosely over her shoulders and applied light makeup, a little mascara, a little blush. She didn't want to look like she was trying, but deep down she knew she was doing it for Sam. The cafe across the street from the library was small, with warm light pouring in from the windows. When Caitlin walked in, she was greeted by a buzz of conversation, mixed with the soft chords of a guitar someone was tuning in the corner. The room was filled with people, mostly young people, students and local creatives, but there were a few older patrons sitting at tables with glasses of wine. Caitlin felt a little out of place, but her eyes quickly found Sam. He was standing near the stage, talking to a woman in a bright scarf who appeared to be the event's organizer. He spotted Caitlin and waved at her, his smile as warm as the cafe's light. "You came," he said, approaching her. He was wearing a dark shirt and jeans, his hair a little neater than usual. "I thought you'd change your mind." "I thought so too," Caitlin replied, smiling. But curiosity won out. "I'm glad you did," he said, his gaze sliding down her dress, lingering a second longer than necessary. "You look great." Caitlin felt her cheeks heat up and quickly looked away, pretending to scan the room. "Thank you," she said, trying to sound casual. "This place is nice." "Yeah, it's nice here," Sam agreed, pointing to a table near the stage. "Come on, I promised you a seat." They sat down at a small round table that already had 2 glasses of wine and a plate of appetizers on it. Caitlin picked up a glass to keep her hands occupied and took a small sip. The wine was light, fruity, and she felt her shoulders relax. "Do you often go to such evenings?" she asked, looking at the stage, where a young guy with long hair began to read poetry. "Sometimes," Sam said, leaning back in his chair. "I like hearing people talk about what's on their minds, even if it sounds a little pompous." Caitlin laughed, and her laugh was genuine, light, as if she were releasing some of the tension. "Pretentious is putting it mildly," she said, nodding toward the guy who was dramatically reciting something about stars and eternity. "But, you know, there's something real about it." "I agree," Sam said, his voice quieter, almost intimate. "Sometimes words are the only way to tell the truth." Caitlin looked at him, and her heart sank again. His words, his look, were too close to what she was feeling. She wanted to ask him about Diana, about Robert, about why he was here, but the moment was too fragile, too charged. Instead, she said, "Have you ever tried writing? Poetry, prose?" "I tried," he shrugged, his smile a little embarrassed. "But I'm not very good. It's better to read someone else's." "I don't believe you," Caitlin said, leaning in a little closer. "You look like someone who has something to say." Sam looked at her, and there was a spark in his eyes, not just interest, but something deeper, almost dangerous. "Maybe there is," he said quietly, "but I haven't found the right words yet." They fell silent, and the air between them grew thicker. The stage changed to a reader, a middle-aged woman reading an essay on love and loss, her voice trembling with emotion. Caitlin listened, but her attention was riveted on Sam, on the way he sat, leaning slightly toward her, the way his hand rested on the table, just inches from hers. She felt the warmth of his presence, and it was both terrifying and compelling. "Caitlin," he said suddenly, his voice soft but firm, "I'm glad you came." "Me too," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. She knew she shouldn't say it, but the words just came out. He smiled, and his hand slid slowly across the table, brushing her fingers. It was a light touch, almost weightless, but it sent a wave of warmth through her body. Caitlin didn't pull away, even though she knew she should. Instead, she let his fingers linger, feeling her pulse quicken. "You're not like the others," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "There's something about you. I don't know how to explain it." Caitlin felt her cheeks heat up. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was ordinary, that she was just a housewife who was lost in her life. But his look, his words, his touch, all of it made her feel different. Desirable, alive. The stage reading ended, and the crowd erupted in applause. Sam pulled his hand away, but his eyes were still on hers. He stood, motioning for her to follow him to the bar for another glass of wine. Caitlin nodded, feeling her legs shake as she stood. They made their way through the crowd, and at one point Sam placed his hand on her waist to guide her through the narrow opening. His touch was warm, confident, and Caitlin felt her body respond despite her best efforts to control herself. She didn't pull away, letting his hand remain on her waist until they reached the bar. "What will you have?" he asked, leaning towards her to shout over the noise of the crowd. "The same as you," she replied, her voice barely audible. He ordered 2 glasses of red, and they returned to the table. But now the atmosphere between them has changed. This was more than flirtation, more than casual touches. It was almost romantic, something that frightened Caitlin with its intensity. She sipped the wine, listened to Sam talk about a poet he had recently read, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Robert, his coldness, his secrets, and about Sam, the way he made her feel alive, but at the same time he was leading her to the edge of an abyss. The evening ended late, and Caitlin felt fatigue mixing with the wine, creating a slight dizziness. Sam offered to walk her home, but she declined, saying she wanted to walk alone. He didn't insist, but his gaze as they said goodbye at the exit of the cafe was full of unspoken words. Caitlin walked home under the stars, her heart torn between guilt and desire. She had let Sam touch her, allowed herself to enjoy his attention, and it was dangerous. She knew she had crossed a line, and that line was getting thinner every day. But at the same time, she couldn't stop herself. She didn't want to, and that was what scared her most. The sky above the Boston suburbs was dark, with a few stars barely visible through the thin cloud cover. Caitlin sat in her car, parked in an alley not far from the cafe where the literary evening had just ended. Her hands were still gripping the steering wheel, though the engine was off and her keys were in her bag on the passenger seat. Her heart was pounding so loudly that she could barely hear the distant rumble of cars passing by. Sam sat next to her in the passenger seat, his dark eyes watching her with the same mixture of curiosity and intensity that had haunted her since that day on the second floor of the library. The evening at the cafe had left her in disarray. His touch on her waist, his words, his closeness, all of it had made her dizzy, like the wine she drank to calm her nerves. She had refused his offer to walk her home, but as they left the cafe, Sam had spotted her car and asked if she would give him a lift to the bus stop. Caitlin had agreed without thinking, driven by some impulse she didn't want to analyze. Now, sitting in the cramped interior of her silver hatchback, she knew it had been a mistake. But it was too late. Sam turned to face her, his hand resting on the armrest, just inches from hers. The light from the alleyway's streetlight fell through the windshield, casting soft shadows on his face, making his features even more sharp. He was in no hurry to get out, and Caitlin was in no hurry to send him away. The silence between them was heavy, charged like the air before a storm. "Thanks for the lift," he said finally, his voice low, almost hoarse. "I didn't think you'd stay the rest of the evening." Caitlin looked at him, her fingers still gripping the steering wheel, even though the car was stationary. "I didn't think so either," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. "But it was interesting." "Interesting?" He smiled slightly, and a spark flickered in his eyes. "Is that all you have to say?" She felt her cheeks heat up. His tone, his gaze, it was all too familiar, too dangerous. She knew she should open the door, say goodbye, and leave, but her body wouldn't obey. Instead, she turned to him, meeting his gaze. "What do you want me to say?" she asked, her voice shaking but with a hint of challenge. Sam leaned a little closer, and Caitlin felt her breathing become ragged. His face was so close that she could see the light stubble on his chin, the dark lashes framing his eyes. The scent of his cologne woody, with a hint of citrus, filled the car, and she felt her skin break out in goosebumps. "I want you to tell me the truth," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "About why you're here. Why didn't you leave when you could?" Caitlin swallowed, her throat dry. She wanted to lie, to say it was just an accident, that she just wanted to help. But his gaze, his closeness, his words, all of it disarmed her, left her defenseless. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely audible. I shouldn't be here." "But you're here," he said, and his hand slid slowly toward hers, brushing her fingers. It was a light touch, but it sent a wave of warmth through her body. "And so am I." Caitlin felt her heart skip a beat. She knew it was wrong. She was married. She suspected that Sam might be connected to Robert's past, that his presence in her life was no accident. But in that moment, it all seemed distant, unreal. The only thing real was his warmth, his gaze, his voice, calling her to cross the line she had been trying so hard to avoid. He leaned closer, and Caitlin didn't pull away. His breath touched her lips, warm and subtle, and she felt her body respond, as if awakening from a long sleep. She closed her eyes, and the next second his lips touched hers, softly, carefully, but with such intensity that she shivered. System. Caitlin sat in her car, parked in a dark alley not far from the cafe where the literary evening had just ended. Her hands were still gripping the steering wheel, though the engine was off and her keys were in her bag on the passenger seat. Her heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out the distant hum of passing cars. Sam sat next to her in the same passenger seat, his dark eyes watching her with that mixture of curiosity and tension that had haunted her since their first meeting. The air in the car was heavy, saturated with something Caitlin didn't want to name but couldn't ignore. The literary evening had left her in disarray. His touch on her waist, his words, his closeness in the cafe, all of it mixed with the wine she'd been drinking to calm her nerves, and now she was dizzy. She'd refused his offer to walk her home, but as they left the cafe, Sam spotted her car and asked if she'd give him a lift to the bus stop. Caitlin had agreed without thinking, driven by an impulse she was afraid to analyze. Now, sitting in the cramped interior of her silver hatchback, she knew it had been a mistake. But she couldn't leave. Sam turned to face her, his hand resting on the armrest just inches from hers. The light from the alleyway's streetlight shone through the windshield, casting soft shadows on his face, highlighting his sharp features. He was in no hurry to get out, and Caitlin was in no hurry to send him away. The silence between them was thick, charged like the air before a storm. "Thanks for the lift," he said finally, his voice low and slightly husky, making her skin crawl. "I didn't think you'd stay the rest of the evening." Caitlin looked at him, her fingers still gripping the steering wheel as if it were her anchor. "I didn't think so either," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. "But I was curious." "Curious?" He smiled slightly, a spark in his eyes that was both playful and dangerous. "Is that all you have to say?" Her cheeks flushed, and she turned away, pretending to look out the side window. His tone, his gaze, it was all too familiar, too exciting. She knew she should open the door, say goodbye, and leave, but her body wouldn't obey. Instead, she turned to him, meeting his gaze. "What do you want me to say?" she asked, and there was a note of challenge in her voice that she herself had not expected. Sam leaned a little closer, and Caitlin felt her breathing become ragged. His face was so close she could see the light stubble on his chin, the dark lashes framing his eyes. The scent of his cologne woody, with a subtle hint of citrus, filled the car, and she felt her pulse quicken. "I want you to tell me the truth," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, but there was a power in it that couldn't be dismissed. "About why you're here. Why didn't you leave when you could?" Caitlin swallowed, her throat dry. She wanted to lie, to say it was just an accident, that she just wanted to help. But his gaze, his closeness, his words, all of it disarmed her, left her defenseless. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice shaking. I I shouldn't be here." "But you're here," he said, and his hand slid slowly toward hers, brushing her fingers. It was a light touch, almost weightless, but it sent a wave of warmth through her body. "And so am I." Her heart skipped a beat. She knew it was wrong. She was married. She suspected that Sam might be connected to Robert's past, that his presence in her life was no accident. But in that moment, it all seemed distant, unreal. The only thing real was his warmth, his gaze, his voice, calling her to cross the line she had been so careful to avoid. He leaned closer, and Caitlin didn't pull away. His breath brushed her lips, warm and subtle, and she felt her body respond, as if awakening from a long sleep. She closed her eyes, and the next second his lips touched hers, softly, carefully, but with such intensity that her world narrowed to that moment. His hand slid to her wrist, then to her waist, pulling her closer. Caitlin kissed him back, her lips moving in response, and for a second she let herself drown in the sensation, in the warmth, in the desire, in the feeling of being alive. But then reality blew in like a cold wind. She remembered Robert, his face, his voice, their marriage. She remembered her suspicions about Diana, about Sam, about the past that might have come between them. She pulled away, her hand pressing against his chest, pushing him away. Her breathing was ragged, and her eyes filled with tears she tried to hold back. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "We can't. It's wrong." Sam looked at her, his eyes dark and full of emotion she couldn't decipher. He didn't look hurt or angry, but rather there was understanding mixed with something that felt like regret. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice soft but firm. "I didn't mean to force you." Caitlin shook her head, her hands still shaking. She wanted to say that it wasn't his fault, that she had let this happen, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned away, looking out the windshield where the lights of the streetlights were reflected. "I have to go," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "Please come out." Sam nodded without arguing. He opened the door, but looked at her before he walked out. "If you want to talk, I'm here," he said, and his voice was sincere, without a hint of pressure. Caitlin didn't answer. She waited for him to get out, for the car door to close with a soft click. Once he was gone into the darkness of the alley, she started the engine and pulled out onto the road, her hands still gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The tears she'd been holding back came pouring out like a dam had burst. She cried without trying to stop, feeling the shame and arousal fighting inside her like two beasts tearing her apart. Shame was heavy, like a stone, pressing against her chest. She was married. She loved Robert, or at least she thought she did. But his coldness, his absence, his secrets about Diana, all of it had brought her to this moment, to this kiss that was both a mistake and a revelation. She hated herself for letting it happen, for enjoying it, for the way her body still trembled under his touch. But the excitement was stronger than she expected. It pulsed through her veins, made her skin burn, her heart beat faster. She felt alive, wanted, visible feelings she had almost forgotten. Sam saw her not as Robert's wife, not as a housewife, but as a woman full of life, full of desire. And the feeling was so powerful that she was afraid she wouldn't be able to refuse it. Caitlin parked outside the house, but didn't get out of the car right away. She sat there, looking at the dark windows, the white picket fence, the perfectly manicured lawn. This house, this life, it was all hers, but it didn't feel like hers anymore. She wiped away the tears, trying to collect herself. Her thoughts were a mess. She remembered the photo of Diana and Robert, his evasive answers, his nervousness when she asked about her. And Sam, his look, his words, his kiss. What if he knew who she was? What if this was all part of a plan? But even if it was, why was it so hard to push him away? She got out of the car, her steps heavy, as if she were carrying the weight of her thoughts on her shoulders. The house was dark, except for the light in Robert's study, but she didn't go there. She couldn't look at him, not after what had happened. Instead, she went up to the bedroom, threw her bag on the floor, and lay down on the bed without undressing. The tears came to her eyes again, but she didn't let them fall. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling her soul torn between desire and morality, between what she wanted and what she had to do. Caitlin knew she couldn't go on like this. She had a decision to make about Sam, about Robert, about herself. But at that moment, she didn't know which one was right. She closed her eyes, and the image of Sam, his dark eyes, his warm breath came back to her, and she felt her body responding again, despite all her guilt. She was on the edge, and the edge was both terrifying and inviting. Caitlin sat in the living room, clutching a mug of cold tea. The windows were open, and the evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from the neighbor's yard. The house was too quiet, almost eerily silent, and the silence added to the chaos inside her. She had barely slept the night before, after kissing Sam in the car. Her thoughts raced between the guilt that squeezed her chest and the excitement she couldn't shake. She had tried to distract herself by cleaning the kitchen, rearranging the books on the shelf, but it was no use. Sam's image, his dark eyes, his lips, his hand on her waist haunted her like a shadow. And the conversation with Robert about Diana, his evasiveness, his nervousness, only added fuel to the fire of her doubts. The door slammed and Caitlin jumped, nearly spilling her tea. Robert came into the living room, his steps heavy, almost aggressive. He threw his briefcase on the sofa and stood looking at her. His face was tense, his eyes cold, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Caitlin felt her heart squeeze. She knew that look came when he was angry, but he was holding himself back, like a predator about to pounce. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, with a sharp edge she hadn't heard before. Caitlin set her mug down on the table, trying to keep her composure. Her palms were clammy and her throat was dry. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but she hadn't expected it to start so abruptly. "About what?" she asked, her voice calmer than she felt. Robert crossed his arms, his gaze never leaving her face. He looked not just tired, but exhausted, as if the last few days had squeezed all the strength out of him. But there was something else in his eyes, not just anger, but something deeper, almost frightening. "About you," he said, his voice growing even sharper. "And about your little adventure in the car last night." Caitlin froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her mind reeled, trying to figure out how he could know. She hadn't told anyone, not even Linda, her only friend. Sam couldn't say anything he'd walked away without looking back, and she was sure he didn't know who Robert was. But his words, his tone, his look, all of it said he didn't just guess. He knew. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to sound confident. Robert chuckled, but there was no warmth in his laughter, only a cold, almost cruel irony. "Don't pretend, Kate," he said, taking a step closer. "I know about you and Sam, about how you let him kiss you, in your car, in the alley outside the cafe. Do you want me to tell you what it looked like?" Her heart skipped a beat, then began beating so fast she felt dizzy. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck. His precision, his certainty, it was impossible. She remembered the dark alley, the empty street, the lack of witnesses. How could he know? "Where did?" she began, but Robert interrupted her, his voice growing louder, almost accusing. "Do you think I'm blind?" he said, his eyes narrowing. "Do you think I don't notice how you've changed? How did you end up spending all your time in that library with that boy? I know everything, Kate. I've seen it." "Saw?" Caitlin stood up, her hands shaking. "What do you mean, saw? Were you following me?" Robert paused, his face unreadable for a second, but then he looked away, and Caitlin saw his jaw tense. It was the same gesture she had seen when she asked about Diana, a sign that he was hiding something important. "Not exactly," he said finally, his voice quieter but still steely. "I set up cameras in the library, in the cafe, and in your car." Caitlin felt her legs give way. She grabbed the back of her chair to steady herself. Cameras. He was watching her. Her mind refused to accept it, but his words, his certainty, his cold gaze, all confirmed the worst. You? What? Her voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. You were spying on me, putting cameras in my car. Robert looked at her, and this time there was a hint of guilt in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by something that looked like righteous anger. I wasn't spying, he said, his voice firm. It was an experiment. My new project in behavioral psychology. I was studying reactions, Kate. People's reactions under emotional stress. And you were the perfect subject. Caitlin felt her blood run cold. An experiment. He had talked about her life, about her feelings, as if it were a laboratory experiment. She remembered his books, his lectures, his endless talk about patterns of behavior, and now it all came crashing down on her like a cold shower. You set this up? She asked, her voice shaking with anger and pain. You set me up to meet Sam? This was all part of your project. Robert sighed, his shoulders slumping as if he was tired of explaining the obvious. Not exactly, he said. I knew about Diana. I knew her son was in Boston. I contacted him, offered him a job at the library. I wanted to see how you'd react, how you'd behave when faced with temptation. It was a controlled environment, Kate. Nothing personal. Nothing personal? Caitlin nearly screamed, her voice shaking with rage. You used me. You used my life, my feelings, like a guinea pig. How could you? Robert stepped towards her, his face hardening. Don't make a big deal out of it, he said, his voice cold. You made your choice, Kate. I didn't make you kiss him. I didn't make you go to those literary soirees, flirt with him, let him touch you. It was your choice. Caitlin felt the tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. His words were a slap in the face, but there was truth in them that cut her like a knife. She had made a choice. She had let Sam get too close, let herself drown in his attention, in his gaze. But the thought that this had all been a setup, that Robert had manipulated her like a puppet, was unbearable. You're sick, she said, her voice low, almost a growl. Were you using me to prove some theory of yours? Did you set me up to cheat on you? I didn't want you to cheat, Robert said, his voice quieter but still steely. I wanted to understand why you were pulling away, why you changed. I thought it would help us, help you. Help me, Caitlin laughed, but her laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. You ruined everything, Robert. You ruined our marriage, our trust, everything we had. And for what? For your damn book. Robert looked at her, and for a second she thought he wanted to apologize, to say he was wrong. But instead he turned away, his face unreadable. It's not just about the book, he said quietly. It's about us, about what we've lost. I thought if I saw how you reacted, I'd know how to get you back. Caitlin shook her head, her tears finally flowing. She felt betrayed, used, crushed. She remembered Sam, his kiss, his warmth, and now it seemed even dirtier, even more wrong. He was part of an experiment, part of Robert's plan. But even now she couldn't shake the feeling that her desire for Sam was real, that she wanted him despite everything. You knew about Sam, she said, her voice shaking. You knew he was Diana's son. You knew I'd find the photo. You set this all up. Robert didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, looking out onto the street where the neighborhood kids were riding their bikes. His silence was an answer in itself. I didn't know how far it would go, he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. I didn't think you'd go this far. Caitlin felt her legs give way. She sat down on the couch, her hands shaking. She wanted to scream, she wanted to hit him, she wanted to leave and never come back. But instead she sat there, looking at him, trying to understand how the man she loved could do something so cruel. What now? She asked, her voice empty, as if all emotion had burned out. What do you want from me, Robert? For me to apologize? For me to stay? He turned to face her, his eyes tired but unrepentant. I want you to understand, he said. I want you to understand that we both made mistakes. I'm not a saint, Kate, but you're not innocent either. Caitlin stood up, her movements jerky, almost mechanical. She couldn't stay in this room, in this house, with this man any longer. She grabbed her bag and headed for the door, not looking at him. "Kate," he called, but she didn't stop. "Where are you going?" "Away from you," she said without turning around. She walked out of the house, slamming the door, and got into the car. Her hands shook as she put the key in the ignition. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. Not after this. She drove through the night streets, her thoughts a mess. She felt betrayed, broken, and yet liberated. Robert knew everything. He had set it all up. But her feelings for Sam, her desire, her arousal, it was all real. And that was what scared her most. She didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear. She couldn't live this lie any longer. She needed to find the truth about herself, about Sam, about what she wanted. And she was ready to face that truth, whatever it was. Caitlin sat in her car, parked in the empty lot of a convenience store, her hands still shaking from her conversation with Robert. The night air was cool, but she didn't notice the cold, her mind too preoccupied with what had just happened. His words, "it was an experiment," echoed in her head like broken glass. He had set everything up, her work at the library, her meeting with Sam, even the feelings she thought were hers. The cameras, the spying, the manipulation. It had all been part of his behavioral psychology project, and she, Caitlin, was nothing more than a guinea pig in his game. But in his eyes, in his voice, in the tenseness of his posture, she sensed something else, something he hadn't been able to hide. Jealousy. And the thought, like a spark in the darkness, ignited a new power within her. She returned home an hour later, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know where else to go. The house greeted her with the same oppressive silence, but now she felt different, not a victim, but a person who was beginning to see the game she had been drawn into. Robert was in his office, his silhouette visible through the half-open door. The light from the monitor reflected on his face, making his features even sharper. Caitlin paused in the doorway, her heart pounding, but now it was not fear, but a strange mixture of anger and determination. "You're still here," Robert said, not taking his eyes off the screen. His voice was even, but there was a tension in it, as if he was waiting for her reaction. "Where should I go?" Caitlin replied, her tone cold, almost sarcastic. "This is my home, or have you already set that up?" Robert finally turned to face her, his brows furrowed. He looked tired, but there was a spark of irritation in his eyes. "Don't start, Kate," he said, his voice sharpening. "I already explained. It was an experiment. I didn't mean to hurt you." "You didn't mean to hurt me." Caitlin stepped into the office, her hands clenching into fists. "You were spying on me, Robert. You set this up so I'd feel something for Sam. You wanted me to cheat on you to prove your damn theory. And now you dare say you didn't mean to hurt me." Robert stood up, his movements sharp, almost aggressive. He walked over to the table, opened the laptop, and turned it toward her. "You want the truth?" he said, his voice low, almost threatening. "Here it is. Look." Caitlin looked at the screen, and her blood ran cold. There was a video on the monitor, grainy but clear enough that she recognized herself. It was the moment in the car, last night, when she and Sam had kissed. The camera, judging by the angle, was mounted somewhere in the car, maybe in the rearview mirror. She saw her face move closer to his hand slide to her waist, their lips brush. The sound was muffled, but she could hear her own breathing, his quiet voice. Then the moment when she pulled away, her hand on his chest, her words, "We can't." Caitlin felt her cheeks burn with shame, but her anger was stronger. "You're sick," she said, her voice shaking but steely. "You installed cameras in my car. You looked at me like I was a lab rat." Robert closed his laptop with a sharp click and turned to face her. His face was tense, but there was an emotion in his eyes that she hadn't expected to see, pain. "Do you think I liked it?" he said, his voice growing louder. "Do you think it was easy for me, watching you flirt with him, letting him touch you? I didn't want that, Kate. I wanted to understand why you were pulling away, why you weren't who you used to be." Caitlin froze, her anger giving way for a second to surprise. She could see it in his eyes, in the clenching of his fists, in the way his voice shook despite his attempts to sound calm. He was jealous. Not just angry, not just controlling, he was hurt. And the thought flashed through her mind like lightning. He hadn't expected her to go this far. He hadn't expected her to almost fall in love with Sam. His experiment, his vaunted science, had spiraled out of control, and now he was as vulnerable as she was. "You're jealous," she said quietly, but her voice was firm, almost accusing. "You set this up to test me, but you didn't think I could feel anything real. You thought I was just, that I would remain your obedient wife who would never cross the line." Robert looked at her, and for a second his mask of the scientist, cold and calculating, cracked. His eyes widened, and he took a step back as if her words had struck him. "It's not like that," he said, but his voice was weaker than before. "I didn't want you to fall in love with him. I wanted you back." "Bring me back," Caitlin laughed, but her laugh was bitter, almost venomous. "You lost me, Robert, the moment you decided you could manipulate me. You watched me through the cameras, you staged my meeting with Sam, you used him to test me, and now you're surprised that I felt something for him. For the man who sees me, who speaks to me, who makes me feel alive." Robert was silent, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. Caitlin could see him struggling with himself, his pride warring with his emotions. And in that moment, she knew she had the power. For the first time in their marriage, she didn't feel weak, didn't feel like a victim. She had been the center of his experiment, but now she was the one who could turn the board. "You didn't expect this, did you?" she said, her voice quieter but still powerful. "You thought I'd just run after a younger guy, feel guilty, and come back to you. But you were wrong. I'm not just your test subject. I'm a person, Robert, and I'm tired of being your puppet." He looked at her, a mixture of anger and despair in his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, but Caitlin raised her hand, stopping him. "Don't," she said. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You wanted the truth? Here it is. I kissed Sam, and I liked it. Not because I wanted to punish you, but because he gave me something you hadn't given me in years. Attention, desire, a sense of meaning." Robert turned away, his jaw set so hard she could see the muscles in his neck tense. He walked to the window, looking out at the dark street, where the streetlights cast long shadows. Caitlin waited, her heart pounding, but she wouldn't back down. She felt tested, humiliated, betrayed, but she also felt strong the strength that his jealousy, his mistake, his vulnerability had given her. "What do you want, Kate?" he asked finally, his voice quiet, almost broken. "Leave? Get a divorce? Throw everything away for this boy?" Caitlin shook her head, her eyes still stinging from the tears she was holding back. "I don't know what I want," she said honestly, "but I know what I don't want. I don't want to live in your experiments. I don't want to be your guinea pig, and I don't want you to decide for me how I should feel." She turned and walked out of the office, her steps steady despite the storm inside. She walked up to the bedroom, closed the door, and leaned against it, feeling her breathing grow ragged. She was shocked, not by his words, but by how she felt. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She didn't feel weak. She saw his jealousy, his fear of losing her, and it gave her power. Not over him, but over herself. Caitlin lay back on the bed, her mind spinning. She remembered Sam, his kiss, his warmth, and she felt the shame again, but now it was mixed with something new: freedom. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if she wanted to keep seeing Sam, didn't know if she wanted to stay with Robert, but she knew she wasn't going to let him control her anymore. She was ready to take charge of her life, even if it meant facing a truth she wasn't ready to accept yet. The autumn wind blew dry leaves across the sidewalk, their rustling mingling with the distant hum of the city. Caitlin stood on the porch of her house, her former home now, with 2 suitcases at her feet. The Boston sky was a deep blue, with a few clouds that looked like they were painted in watercolor. She took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill her lungs, and looked out at the white picket fence, the perfectly manicured lawn, the neat windows that no longer held her life. It hadn't been an easy decision to leave, But standing here now, she felt a strange relief, as if she'd lifted a weight she'd been carrying for years. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions. The conversation with Robert, his confession about the cameras, his experiment, how he had set her up to meet Sam, had turned everything upside down. She had felt betrayed, used, but his jealousy, his vulnerability, had given her unexpected strength. She realized that she no longer wanted to be part of his games, his theories, his world where she was just an object of observation. And Sam, his dark eyes, his warmth, his kiss was part of this chaos, too. She couldn't trust him, couldn't be sure that his feelings were genuine and not part of a plan she didn't fully understand. And in this chaos, Caitlin made the only choice that felt right. She chose herself. She didn't give Robert a long goodbye. After their last conversation, when she made it clear she wouldn't live in his experiments, he'd tried to stop her not with pleading, but with his usual manipulation, a mixture of guilt and logic. But Caitlin was adamant. She packed up her things, leaving behind everything that reminded her of the past photos, gifts, even her wedding ring, which now sat on the dresser in the bedroom. She didn't know if the divorce would be official, but she knew she didn't want to be Robert's wife anymore. Sam was more difficult. She saw him in the library the day after her conversation with Robert, and the look in his eyes, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, almost broke her. She wanted to ask him if he knew about Robert's plan, if he was a pawn or a player. But deep down, she knew the answer didn't matter. Her feelings for him, strong as they were born of lies, of manipulation, and she couldn't build a future on that. She said goodbye briefly, saying she was leaving the library, apologizing for her abruptness. He didn't argue, but his silence, his eyes full of unspoken words, haunted her for days. Caitlin found a small apartment in downtown Boston, an old brick building with tall windows and creaky wood floors. It was far from the suburbs, from the perfect lawns and empty houses. The apartment was small, with worn furniture and the smell of old paint, but it felt real to her. For the first time in years, Caitlin felt like this place belonged to her, not Robert, not their marriage, but herself. She spent the first few days setting up the space, buying a few books, hanging a Monet on the wall, placing a pot of violets on the windowsill. These were small things, but they gave her a sense of beginning, of fresh air. She quit her job at the library, too. Mrs. Edwards was disappointed, but Caitlin explained that she needed to move on. She didn't mention Sam, she didn't mention Robert, but her voice, her determination, spoke for itself. Emma hugged her goodbye, promising to call, but Caitlin knew she wouldn't keep in touch. The library was part of the past, part of the life she had left behind. Her new life began with a job search. Caitlin had always loved literature, and although her English degree had been gathering dust in a drawer for over a decade, she decided it was time to return to what had once made her happy. She began sending out resumes to universities and colleges, offering her services as a teacher or assistant. Her experience was modest, but her passion for books, for words, for stories was genuine, and it seemed to impress one of the deans of a small liberal arts college in Boston. 2 weeks after moving in, Caitlin received a letter inviting her to an interview. She put on a simple black dress, pulled her hair into a neat bun, and walked into the dean's office with her head held high. The interview was long, but she felt confident talking about Jane Austen, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman. She talked about how literature can be a mirror to human emotions, how it helps us understand ourselves and others. The dean, an older woman with sharp eyes, nodded, making notes in her notebook. 3 days later, Caitlin received an offer, a teaching position in the literature department with the opportunity to teach her own course. She began preparing for her first lecture with an enthusiasm she had not felt in years. The topic came to her almost immediately: the boundaries between seduction and betrayal. This was not just an academic exercise, it was her own story, her struggles, her choices, translated into literary language. She reread novels, poems, essays, looking for quotes that could illustrate her thoughts. She thought about heroes who faced choices: Anna Karenina, Hester Prynne, even Medea, and how their decisions reflected her own doubts, her own pain. The day of her first lecture arrived sooner than she expected. The morning was clear, with a slight autumn chill that made her cheeks flush. Caitlin stood in front of the mirror in her new apartment, adjusting the navy blazer she had bought especially for this day. She looked at her reflection and smiled at herself for the first time in a long time. Not at Robert's wife, not at the woman who had almost lost herself in the expectations of others, but at Caitlin, the woman who had chosen herself. The room was small but full. Students, mostly freshmen, sat at their desks, some leafing through their notebooks, others looking at her curiously. Caitlin walked up to the podium, her heart beating fast, but it wasn't fear. It was excitement, the excitement of someone who's finally doing what she loves. "Good morning," she began, her voice firm but warm. "Today we begin our course with a topic that may seem difficult to you, but I believe it is close to each of us. We will talk about the boundaries between seduction and betrayal and how literature helps us understand where that line is and why we so often cross it." She paused, looking at the students' faces. Some were taking notes, others were simply listening, but she felt their attention, their interest. This was her place, her moment. She began with a quote from Anna Karenina, talking about how Anna was seduced not just by love, but by a desire to feel alive. She moved on to Dickinson's poetry, to her lines about the heart beating wildly in search of meaning. And with each word, Caitlin felt her own story woven into these texts, her pain, her choices, her liberation echoed in the words of great authors. "Temptation," she said, her voice quieter but more penetrating, "is not just about physical attraction. It's about the desire to be seen, heard, understood. And betrayal, it begins not when we cross the line, but when we betray ourselves, our values, our truth." And literature teaches us to find balance, to return to ourselves, even if we have lost our way. The students listened, and Caitlin saw sparks in their eyes, sparks of curiosity, understanding, maybe even recognition. She finished her lecture by answering a few questions, and when the room emptied, she stood at the lectern, looking at the empty desks. She felt light, almost weightless. This was not the end of her journey, but the beginning. She had chosen herself, not Robert, not Sam, not the past, but herself. And in this new life, among books and words and ideas, she was finally beginning to find peace. Caitlin walked out of the classroom, her steps confident and her chest warm. She knew there would be challenges ahead, divorce, questions, doubts. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready to write her own story, page by page, word by word. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.